My daughter-in-law treated me like a servant. One day before Christmas, she smirked. "My friends are spending Christmas here. It's only 25 people." She expected me to cook, clean, and bow. I smiled. That night, I flew to Florida for a trip. When they arrived and saw the empty kitchen, her face turned pale. But the real surprise was still to come. Before we dive in, feel free to subscribe and share where you're listening from. Now, let me take you into a story that changed my life forever and taught me that sometimes the greatest victories come not from confrontation, but from quiet dignity and well-timed revelation. My name is Edward Grant, and I am 61 years old. When I look back over the past few years, I see a man who had somehow allowed himself to become invisible. In his own son's home, treated as little more than convenient background noise, a helpful presence to manage household chores, set elaborate dinner tables, and orchestrate complex meals that required hours of preparation and meticulous attention to detail. My daughter-in-law, Clara, never bothered to ask if I wanted to help with these endless domestic demands. She simply assumed I would comply, as if my willingness to contribute to the household had somehow transformed me into her personal staff member. The requests came as casual commands. Prepare appetizers for her business associates, deep clean the house before her dinner parties, coordinate catering deliveries, while she focused on selecting the perfect outfit to impress her guests. Each task was presented not as a favor between family members, but as an expected duty that came with my residency under their roof. Holidays became the most painful reminders of how completely I had disappeared from view as an individual worthy of respect. While Clara glided through these gatherings in expensive silk dresses, charming her colleagues and business contacts with practiced ease, I stood in the kitchen with my sleeves rolled up, orchestrating elaborate dinners that guests would praise effusively. Everyone except the two people under whose roof I lived. My son Michael seemed genuinely blind to how one-sided this arrangement had become, or perhaps he simply found it easier to look away than to address the uncomfortable dynamic that had taken root in his marriage. After my beloved wife's death 3 years earlier, I had moved in with Michael and Clara during my period of grief, telling myself it would be temporary. But somewhere along the way, I had allowed myself to slip quietly into this diminished role, convincing myself that being useful was better than being alone, that contributing to their household was a fair exchange for companionship and family connection. The loneliness of widowhood had made me grateful for any sense of belonging, even if that belonging came at the cost of my dignity. What they never realized, what I had never bothered to mention during those years of silent service, was that beneath their assumptions about my retirement and financial dependence lay a reality that would have shocked them both. While they saw a grieving widower grateful for their charity, I had quietly built something remarkable of my own, something that would soon reveal just how wrong their assumptions about me had been. The man they treated as invisible was about to remind them that respect is earned through character, not commanded through circumstance. The breaking point arrived on a cold December afternoon, delivered with the casual cruelty that had become Clara's signature style. She swept into the living room where I was reading, her designer heels clicking against the hardwood floor. With the confident rhythm of someone who had never doubted her authority in this house, without so much as a greeting or acknowledgement of my presence, she announced her latest demand, with the kind of entitled certainty that made my chest tighten with familiar resignation. 25 of her most important business associates would be descending upon the house on Christmas Eve, she informed me, making it sound like a small, almost trivial gathering that required minimal effort. The way she emphasized the word only, as if 25 guests represented some modest number that any reasonable person should be able to handle without complaint, revealed just how completely disconnected she had become from the reality of what such an event actually required. For Clara, this gathering represented the perfect opportunity to showcase her social connections and professional network, a chance to demonstrate her importance in the competitive world of public relations, where perception often mattered more than substance. She spoke about the guest list with undisguised pride, dropping names of executives and entrepreneurs who would grace her dining room table, transforming her home into a stage where she could perform the role of successful hostess, an influential power broker. For me, however, her announcement represented something entirely different, a comprehensive demand that I cook elaborate meals for 24 sophisticated palates, deep clean every room to museum-quality standards, coordinate the intricate logistics of serving multiple courses to a large group, and then make myself scarce once the guests arrived, so that Clara could take full credit for the seamless hospitality they would experience. But this time, something fundamental had shifted within me. Instead of feeling the familiar sting of being treated like hired help, I experienced something I hadn't felt in years: absolute clarity. The resignation that had characterized my response to previous demands was replaced by a calm certainty that made me almost smile at the timing of her request. What Clara didn't know, what she had never bothered to inquire about, during all those months of treating me as her personal domestic staff, was that I had a plane ticket tucked away in my desk drawer. My company, Grant Hospitality Group, the consultancy business I had built quietly and methodically over the past decade, was on the verge of finalizing its most significant contract in the firm's history. In Florida, Isabella Cortez, the CEO of one of the nation's most prestigious luxury resort chains, was waiting to discuss a multi-million-dollar partnership that could transform my consultancy from a regional success story into a nationally recognized industry leader. The meeting had been scheduled for months, representing the culmination of careful relationship building and strategic positioning that had consumed countless hours of preparation and planning. For 10 years, I had nurtured this business with deliberate discretion, choosing to keep my professional achievements separate from my home life. What I had once considered humility and respect for family boundaries, I now realized had become something far less noble, a form of self-imposed invisibility that had enabled their mistreatment to flourish unchallenged. In that moment, faced with Clara's smirk and her absolute certainty that I would once again bow to her demands, I made a choice that would change everything. This time, I would not be available to play the role of invisible servant. This time, I had somewhere far more important to be. I left without protest, without lengthy explanations or dramatic confrontations that might have satisfied some deep need for vindication. Instead, I simply packed my bag that evening, called a taxi to the airport, and boarded the flight to Florida that would carry me toward the most important business meeting of my professional life. The silence I left behind in that house would soon transform into something far more chaotic than Clara could have ever anticipated. By the time my plane reached cruising altitude, I found myself experiencing an unexpected sense of liberation. For years, I had convinced myself that keeping peace in the family required me to absorb every slight, accept every demand, and maintain a diplomatic silence, even when my dignity was being systematically eroded. But as I settled into my seat and watched the city lights disappear below, I realized that my departure represented something far more significant than simply missing one of Clara's social gatherings. It was my first step toward reclaiming the man I had been, before grief and loneliness had made me so grateful for scraps of belonging. Back at the house, Clara's carefully orchestrated Christmas Eve celebration began crumbling before the first guest crossed the threshold. The elaborate menu I was supposed to prepare remained nothing more than notes in her planner. The countless hours of prep work she had taken for granted, the marinated appetizers, the perfectly timed main courses, the coordinated service that made entertaining 25 people appear effortless, simply didn't exist. As 6 o'clock approached, and guests began arriving in their expensive cars, expecting the kind of seamless hospitality that had become Clara's signature, they instead found a hostess growing increasingly frantic, and a kitchen that stood conspicuously empty. The elegant dining room table sat bare, except for the fine china and crystal glasses. That meant nothing without the food that was supposed to fill them. Clara's attempts to salvage the evening grew more desperate by the hour. Restaurants throughout the city had closed early for the holiday. Catering companies were unavailable on such short notice, and even the most expensive delivery services had suspended operations. By 7 o'clock, her most important professional contacts, the very people she had hoped to dazzle with her hosting prowess, found themselves seated around her dining room table, with boxes of hastily ordered pizza, arranged awkwardly on her grandmother's antique serving plates. Among those guests, watching this spectacle of social disaster unfold, with the keen eye of someone who understood the intricacies of hospitality management, sat Isabella Cortez, the very woman Clara had hoped to impress above all others. Isabella observed the chaos with professional interest, noting how quickly elegant pretense could collapse when the underlying systems of support were removed. She listened as Clara made increasingly frantic excuses, blaming everyone from the weather to unreliable vendors, even whispering to her closest associates that her useless father-in-law had somehow failed them. At the crucial moment, meanwhile 3,000 miles away, I was being welcomed at a luxury resort overlooking the Atlantic Ocean, with the kind of respect and professional courtesy that had become foreign to me in my own family's home. Champagne chilled in my suite, accompanied by a handwritten note from Isabella, expressing her enthusiasm for our upcoming partnership discussions. As I stood on my balcony, watching the moonlight dance across the waves, I couldn't help but marvel at the perfect symmetry unfolding. The same woman my daughter-in-law was desperately trying to impress, with her social theatrics, would soon be shaking my hand as an equal, recognizing me not as someone's invisible father-in-law, but as a respected leader in the hospitality industry, whose expertise she valued highly enough to seek out personally. The next morning, I walked into the boardroom of Pinnacle Hospitality's Florida headquarters, carrying the presentation I had refined and perfected over countless hours during the past 6 months. The floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the pristine coastline, and the conference table was set with the kind of attention to detail that spoke of an organization that understood the subtle art of making important people feel valued. This was the moment I had been building toward, not just the culmination of months of preparation, but the validation of a decade spent quietly establishing myself as a respected voice in an industry I had grown to love. Isabella Cortez entered the room with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of employees and millions in revenue. As I delivered my presentation, outlining the comprehensive hospitality strategy the Grant Hospitality Group had developed for her resort chain, I watched her expression shift from polite professional interest to genuine engagement. The philosophy I had built my consultancy around, creating hospitality experiences rooted in authentic respect rather than manufactured service, clearly resonated with her vision for the company's future direction. Midway through my presentation, I noticed something change in Isabella's demeanor. A flicker of recognition passed across her face, followed by what appeared to be growing understanding. As pieces of some puzzle began falling into place in her mind, she was connecting dots that I hadn't yet realized existed, drawing lines between the disastrous Christmas Eve dinner she had witnessed in Boston and the confident business leader now standing before her in this Florida boardroom. The man who had been whispered about as Clara's useless, unreliable father-in-law, the invisible domestic help who had somehow failed to appear when needed most, was revealing himself to be something entirely different. I was not the helpless dependent my daughter-in-law had portrayed to her guests, not the grateful charity case living off my son's generosity, but rather a successful entrepreneur whose expertise Isabella valued highly enough to seek out personally for a partnership worth millions of dollars. By the time I concluded my presentation, the energy in the room had shifted dramatically. Isabella's questions were sharp and insightful, demonstrating not only her grasp of the hospitality industry's complexities, but also her recognition that she was dealing with someone whose understanding of the business matched her own sophisticated standards. When she extended her hand to finalize our partnership agreement, I realized that this handshake represented far more than a business transaction. It was a moment of professional validation that stood in stark contrast to the domestic dismissal I had endured for years. News of the Grant Hospitality Group's major contract spread quickly through industry circles, as these kinds of significant partnerships always do. In the interconnected world of luxury hospitality, trade publications picked up the story. Professional networks buzzed with congratulations, and my company's phone began ringing with inquiries from other major resort chains interested in similar consulting arrangements. Meanwhile, back in Boston, the aftermath of Clara's Christmas Eve disaster continued to reverberate through her professional and social circles. The story of the elegant dinner party that devolved into takeout pizza served on fine china became the kind of cautionary tale that spreads quickly through competitive social environments. Her PR firm began losing key clients who questioned whether someone who couldn't manage her own household could effectively manage their corporate reputations. The woman who had built her identity around appearances and social connections found herself haunted by the very visibility she had once craved, but now for all the wrong reasons. The irony was not lost on me that Isabella Cortez, the same person Clara had desperately hoped to impress with her hosting abilities, was now my business partner, someone who respected my professional judgment and valued my expertise enough to stake her company's expansion plans on my team's strategic guidance. Months passed before I agreed to meet my son and Clara at a neutral location, a quiet restaurant downtown, where the conversation could unfold without the emotional baggage that had accumulated within the walls of their home. Time had softened the sharp edges of my anger, but it had done nothing to diminish my resolve. I had learned too much about my own worth during those months of professional success and personal rediscovery to ever return to the role of invisible, grateful dependent that I had once accepted as the price of family belonging. When I walked into that restaurant, I carried myself differently than I had in years. The confidence that had always existed in my business dealings, but had somehow been checked at my son's front door, was now an integral part of who I was in every setting. I was no longer compartmentalizing my identity, no longer allowing family dynamics to diminish the man I had worked decades to become. I laid out my boundaries with the same precision I had once used to draft architectural plans and now employed to structure business partnerships. If we were to rebuild our family relationship, certain fundamental principles would need to be established and honored. I would be treated with respect, not as unpaid household staff, whose time and energy could be commandeered at will. I would be acknowledged for who I actually was, a successful professional with my own achievements and responsibilities, rather than dismissed as the convenient, invisible helper they had imagined me to be. Most importantly, I made it clear that if they could not honor these basic requirements for dignified treatment, I would walk away permanently. This was not a threat delivered in anger, or a negotiating tactic designed to gain temporary advantage. It was simply a statement of fact about the life I had chosen to live moving forward, one where self-respect was non-negotiable, and my value was recognized rather than taken for granted. To my genuine surprise, Michael finally found his voice and admitted regret for the years of silence that had enabled Clara's treatment of me to continue unchallenged. He acknowledged that his conflict-averse nature had made him complicit in a dynamic that he had always found uncomfortable, but had lacked the courage to address directly. Clara, her characteristic arrogance notably diminished by the professional consequences she had experienced, offered an apology that was halting and imperfect, but seemed to come from a place of genuine recognition rather than mere social obligation. I accepted their words cautiously, understanding that forgiveness is a process rather than a single moment of decision, and that forgiveness itself is not the same as erasure of past experiences or blind trust in future behavior. Relationships that have been damaged by years of disrespect cannot be healed overnight through conversation alone. They require sustained demonstration of changed attitudes and consistent respectful treatment over time. That spring, I hosted a family dinner of my own, catered by my professional staff, in my own apartment overlooking the city's skyline, where I had built my new independent life. As Maria, my executive chef, and James, my operations manager, moved efficiently through the evening. With the respectful professionalism that characterized all my business relationships, I watched my son and Clara sit quietly at my table, not as rulers of a household, where I existed at their sufferance, but as guests in my domain, witnessing firsthand the respect and competence that had always defined me outside their limited perception. It was never about revenge or proving superiority. It was about reclaiming the dignity that had somehow gotten lost in the shuffle of grief, loneliness, and misguided gratitude. For the first time in years, I felt complete. A man whose professional success and personal relationships finally reflected the same values of mutual respect and authentic worth. Thank you for being here. Don't forget to subscribe, and feel free to share your story in the comments. Every voice has value.